Welcome to the UW Now Live. Tonight, we're discussing Trumponomics, including tariffs, budgets, and the Fed, and the state of the U.S. economy. Our panelists and the host for this discussion are all economists. Menzie Chinn is a professor of public affairs and economics at the La Follette School of Public Affairs. Lydia Cox is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and an expert in international trade. The conversation will be moderated by your host, Mike Knetter.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. We'll be revisiting some topics that we've taken up before on the show. You might remember back in February, we dove into tariffs in international relations. In May, we talked about the potential impact of fiscal policy proposals. And now here we are in August, we're seeing some updated and likely more permanent tariff rates established with our trading partners, and an enacted budget bill, and some additional data on the health of the U.S. economy. So it's a great time to take stock. And, one thing I will say is the Trump administration has been extremely busy in its efforts to manage the economy. I would say really kind of unprecedented in terms of the number of changes that have been introduced in a fairly short period of time. And, obviously, I think these policies are intended to have very long-run impacts on the economy, and obviously the administration thinks they will be positive. It's also fair to say some of these proposals run a bit counter to economic orthodoxy, to the extent anyone cares about what the economics profession thinks anymore. But, and that's kind of the subtext for tonight's show. And I'm really delighted to have Professors Lydia Cox and Menzie Chinn with us this evening. As noted in the intro, Lydia has done a lot of work on tariffs and their impact in markets, and Menzie has done a lot of work on international macro, and they'll both give us some perspectives on how they see things unfolding. But, in particular, we kind of want to know how high are these tariff levels to the extent they've really been firmly established, and how do they compare with tariffs a year or two ago? Are we seeing any impact of the tariffs on prices, or are foreign producers really just eating these in their profit margins? Or could the biggest impacts be yet to come? And then how will the federal budget bill impact consumption, investment, the trade balance, and GDP growth? And, will the administration continue to exert more pressure on the Federal Reserve? That's another area where I'd say we're kind of breaking with orthodoxy and maybe questioning whether an independent Fed is really a good thing. And people talked a lot about whether the economy would have a soft landing. I'm starting to wonder whether Jerome Powell will have a soft landing. Doesn't look like it right now. But with that as our intro, let's move to our guests. And we're going to kick off this evening with Menzie Chinn from the La Follette School of Public Affairs. And Menzie is going to talk about his thoughts on macro and international macro, and where he sees us headed. So thank you, Menzie.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the introduction. A pleasure to be here at this critical juncture, I think, in the world economy and the American economy. Let me just jump right in and set the stage for where are we currently. And it's not an easy question to answer, but I'm going to try my best. And the first thing is to say, you probably heard about this rebound in growth last quarter, the second quarter of 2025, where we had 3% growth. On average, we're growing 2% growth. So that seems like a great number. What you can see in this graph is that solid black line was GDP as it was growing until end of 2024. And then the first quarter, we had this negative 0.5% growth. And then we've had this 3% growth. That's if you annualize these numbers. So you might think, wow, great recovery. I'll just point out that gray line is the trajectory we would have had if we had kept up with the 2023-2024 trend. And so, yes, growth is back, but we're down relative to where we were before. And I can tell you that we have bean counters who take all the latest numbers from all over and try to get a sense of what GDP will be in the third quarter. We're in the third quarter right now. It started in July. That light blue square is their best guess. It'll change over time as we come up to the release, which is going to take place in October. So long time to go. Can be many revisions, but you can see that best guesses are not saying we're going to go back to that gray line. So I'll mention the red line is the average value from Wall Street Journal's forecasters, the survey that they do. So, what do we know? We know probably people view the growth rate is going to be lower, and probably we're going to be on a lower trajectory over time. Now, you might say, okay, now we know what's going on. And I'll just say, we don't know what's going on because this number that we typically rely upon, well, Mike said these are amazing, sort of strange times. Well, those are my words. And so we can't quite rely on GDP, and I'll show you why. So this might seem confusing, but let me just try to highlight the lilac bars are GDP. In each of the quarters. And, you can see in the first quarter, we had of 2025, we had a little bit of a negative lilac bar there. All those other bars are components of GDP growth. And then you see that dark blue line. What was that? That is imports. And in the accounting sense, imports deduct from GDP. GDP is the sum of all the stuff we make within the borders of the United States. We imported tons in the first quarter. And you might say, well, why? Well, it's exactly tariffs. Everybody was trying to front run the tariffs. They might not have known what level they were going to be, but they were pretty sure they were coming. And so the first quarter, you had a big increase in imports, which deducted from GDP. Then the tariffs started coming in. And so in the second quarter, what you have is a big decrease in GDP, big decrease in imports. And so GDP jumped up, but you can see, what's going on is GDP is being whipsawed all around by people changing their behavior in response to these unprecedented tariffs. And in principle, if we were counting up inventory, like lots of companies brought in extra, widgets, steel, whatever, and they put it in inventory to use later on. If we counted the inventories right, this would have all washed out, but it didn't. And so it's hard to rely upon GDP as an indicator right now of where the economy is going, just because everything's been distorted by tariffs. So in some sense, you might not have felt the tariffs yet. I think we are. But even if you haven't felt it, it's shown up in masses of imports, and now traffic into the ports is decreasing as we are cutting back as the price of imports have risen. So what do we look at? Well, we can look at other indicators which tell us the state of the economy. And so what I've done is I've rebased a whole bunch of series to the first month of 2023. And what you see here is personal income is the green line. It's what we're all earning from wages and whatever stock income and so forth in real terms, but taking out, let's say, Social Security transfers. And so the thing I want to take a look at there is it's been rising since 2023, but it's now falling. Question is, will it continue to fall? The other thing is the number that Mike mentioned. We have this non-farm payroll employment. That's the dark blue line. And that missed what economists thought was going to come. That's that plus sign, the plus sign that's blue. So that was exactly part of the reason why the markets tanked on Friday. It's because we thought we had strong employment growth throughout 2025, and suddenly there's been a revision to the previous months, and you only have 73,000 jobs created instead of the 100,000 jobs. To be truthful, it's the previous months that were revised downwards so that in sum you had like 250,000 jobs creation erased. And so what we thought was a fairly strong economy is now looking a little lackluster, if not struggling. There's another measure of employment, which is this orange line. And what that is you, instead of calling up companies and asking them how many jobs they have, you call up households and ask how many people are employed. And then you try to blow that up to account for the size of the population. And that's that orange line. And you'll note that that orange line is declining. Only thing that's really solidly going up is industrial production. It's rebounded from the doldrums, from 2022 onwards to 2025. It's rebounded. So that's one thing that's going up, but industrial production is only about 17% of the economy. So I think, if you wonder why you hear one bit of news and the market tanks, part of it is because we have ever more growing evidence that the economy is slowing. And the question is it enough and sustained enough to tip the economy into a recession? And that's why, in part, this issue about the tariffs is so critical at this time. It is, partly the tariffs have influenced behavior already because people are looking forward in time, but it's also, if you get hit by tariffs, that's going to tend to make everything more expensive. It's also going to tend to make it harder for us to export. And so you can see a bunch of things that could push the economy from what's still growing in some components, some areas, into something that's going in a tailspin. Okay, so look to more indicators besides GDP. If I had to guess, I'd say underlying growth in GDP is probably a little bit over 1%. So maybe up to 1.2%. Which is slower than, of course, what we thought was this 3% rebound. So we have a figure on the state of the economy, and the question you might have is, can we trust the numbers? And the most recent issue is, of course, the BLS, the statistics on employment, which I just referred to. And of course, what you know is that the commissioner of the BLS was fired because President Trump alleged that the numbers were rigged. Now, the numbers, you might say, how can you be surprised by, by this amount, like 250,000 jobs disappearing? And I'll say two things, counting up all, 170 million workers in the U.S. economy. That's a lot of keeping track of. And so you can't survey every company or you can't survey every household to keep track. So we sample. And in sampling, you only take a subset. You have to extrapolate a little bit. You have seasonality that you want to take into account. That is, December, there's always more employment, but that's artificial. You want to smooth that out so you don't pay attention to it. All those things, plus idiosyncrasies like, did school start early in the year or did it start late in the year? Early in the month or later in the month. And because the BLS samples in the second week of each month, that can have an impact too. You can misestimate. What I'll point out is before this last release, we were on essentially that purple line at the top. That was what we thought things were doing in July through the month of June. The number that came out on Friday was this black line that's bold. And you might say, well, why did it shift downwards? Well, we had better information. We got more counts. We got additional information. And I'll note, can you believe this number better than another? We have from a company that processes checks for millions of workers, actually. So they cut checks for companies that are too small to cut their own checks. And that's called automatic data processing, ADP. And what you see is that green line is an independent series. It's not government, it's private sector generated. And what do you see? You see that the purple line on the top showed a lot less similarity to that green line below. In fact, the black line has moved down. And so you can criticize the BLS for maybe not having great estimates. I'd say if you wanted better estimates, you'd hire more workers. It's also the case that people don't answer their phones as much as they used to. And so the BLS has to sort of pursue these companies and households, but companies in this case, to get better response rates. And so that's been a problem that's been here since the pandemic. That certainly combined with budget cuts probably means that, we're less accurate these days in terms of tracking employment. But I would say nobody who's credible believes that the numbers are rigged. Time and time again, investigations show that no, numbers are not rigged. Just you could have done a better job. We can always do a better job. Well, those are all the pictures I have to present, but I'll just point out, what's clear is employment growth is decelerating to something like 60, 70,000 jobs per month. And so this is very close to what some people would call stall speed. Like you don't go very close to zero without falling below zero growth rate. And so this is a time when two things are coming up: the tariffs, which Lydia will discuss, but in detail. But it's also because of the tariffs and because of the sort of unsettled nature of policymaking in this administration, you have record high levels of uncertainty. In terms of policy uncertainty, it's as high as during the pandemic. In terms of trade uncertainty, it's higher than anything that's been recorded that we know. And so, to the extent that tariffs and uncertainty are weighing down on growth, that's going to mean that the future is incredibly misty. We really don't know. Likely those two things would depress growth. And that's why so many economists are worried.
All right, Menzie, thank you for those remarks and sharing some of that data and your thoughts. I can see some questions rolling in, which we'll get to. But first, we're going to give the floor to Lydia Cox to talk in a little more depth about what she sees when she looks at the tariff situation and how that's unfolding and impacting consumers and the economy writ large. So, Lydia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit more in detail about the tariffs and kind of what the impacts we're seeing so far in terms of their effects on the economy. So, the first thing to know is just that the tariffs that are currently in place, as of last week, have brought kind of average tariffs in the U.S. to their highest levels in almost a century. So the last time we had tariffs that were at this level were, if you remember from kind of your U.S. History classes, the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And pretty much since then, tariff rates have been declining until now. So again, I want to spend just a few minutes kind of talking about the impacts that we're seeing so far and kind of what, at least my best guess of kind of what we should expect to see going forward in terms of the effects on the economy. So, I think probably the primary thing that economists warned about before any of these tariffs were put in place was that they would cause prices to rise and they would kind of put this upward pressure on inflation. And it's been a bit slow to materialize, but the most recent months of data are confirming that inflation is starting to creep up and likely because of the tariffs. So just as kind of a quick reminder, when the US imposes tariffs on foreign countries, it's the US importers that are responsible for, literally paying the bill to the US government in order to take possession of imported goods and get those goods through customs. And so what this means is that the only way that foreign countries kind of pay for the tariffs is if they lower the prices of the imports that they're selling to the US. And we actually, collect data on U.S. import prices, excluding the tariffs. So we know kind of the levels of the prices that foreign countries are charging the U.S. And so the graph I'm showing you here is just that kind of index of import prices. And you can see that import prices haven't fallen since the tariffs were imposed, kind of starting in early this year. So what that tells us is that it's not kind of the foreign countries that are paying for these tariffs, but somebody in the U.S. is paying those costs. And in our kind of gauges of prices, both for U.S. firms and for U.S. consumers, we are starting to see these increases. So in particular, we have a price gauge for U.S. firms, the Producer Price Index, which measures kind of the prices that firms pay for all the stuff that they buy. And that has been rising in recent months. So this tells us that U.S. companies are kind of starting to see those price increases. And then our gauge of prices that U.S. consumers face, the Consumer Price Index, is also rising. And this tells us that businesses are starting to pass some of those higher costs on to consumers. And in particular, in the most recent month of data, what we saw is that things like appliances and apparel, those are some of the categories where prices are increasing the most. And these are, of course, goods that we import a lot from China. And so these are some of the things that have seen the largest tariff increases so far. So this is all kind of confirming that, what we expected to see, the tariffs putting pressure on prices, is starting to materialize. Now, as I mentioned, the changes in prices have been a bit slow, even to the point where, some there were news articles and such sort of saying, well, maybe economists have it wrong and the tariffs really aren't going to raise inflation. But there are a couple of factors that I think have kind of helped keep a lid on prices so far. But these are things that aren't going to kind of continue to keep a lid on prices going forward. So the first one is just that only some of the tariffs have actually been in place for a good amount of time. So there's been a lot of announcements of tariffs that were, either postponed or retracted. And it's only now that kind of the full extent of the tariffs that the administration has been discussing are really going to start kicking in. So as more things start to be taxed, we expect to kind of see prices continue to go up even more. Second is that many companies in the U.S. were expecting these tariffs to go in when Trump was elected. And so they started stockpiling imports before the tariffs were put in place because they were expecting tariffs to rise in the future. And so because they didn't have to actually pay the tariffs on those stockpiled goods, they're able to sell those goods without raising prices that much and without kind of cutting into their margins. So they haven't had to necessarily raise their prices to the full extent of the tariffs while they're still kind of relying on those built up inventories. And then finally, kind of anecdotally, many firms have reported that they've been absorbing the price increases, especially while there's been a lot of uncertainty about where the tariffs would ultimately land. But now that there's more clarity that the tariffs are likely here to stay, producers are likely going to start kind of passing those costs on to consumers because most businesses just don't have the margins to absorb, these 30% and higher increases in costs, in perpetuity. So that's kind of, the price side of things. I think, again, we're kind of starting to see the effects on prices that we expected. Menzie talked a lot about kind of the economy more broadly and GDP, so I'm not going to talk about this too much. But as he mentioned, we are starting to see kind of the effects of tariffs on employment and growth in the U.S. as well. U.S. GDP is still growing at a pretty good clip, but there are these underlying signs of weakness that Menzie mentioned. And in particular, this slowing U.S. employment growth is a bit of a red flag. And I have a graph here just showing that over the last 3 months, the manufacturing industry has actually continued to shed jobs, which may be a bit of a surprise given that these tariffs are kind of being put in place and they're supposed to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. So it's a little bit counterintuitive that, employment and output are going down. But again, I think there are a few factors that are kind of contributing to this. So the first one is just kind of this on again, off again rollout of the tariffs that we've seen, starting in April and even a little bit before. And this has just created a lot of uncertainty for US businesses. So the graph I'm showing you here is a measure that economists use to think about policy uncertainty, and in particular, trade policy uncertainty. And you can see very clearly here that trade policy uncertainty has just skyrocketed in recent months, really to levels that we've never seen before. And so this uncertainty about whether tariffs will be in place or not, whether they'll be high or whether they'll be low, really makes it tough for businesses to make decisions about investment and hiring. And so instead, businesses have just kind of had to wait it out while these tariffs are eating into their margins, which just makes it hard for them to kind of grow. The second issue, and this is one that economists were also kind of warning about before the tariffs were in place, is that tariffs are really a double-edged sword. They do provide some protection from competition for U.S. producers, but the problem is that many U.S. manufacturers use imports as inputs to their production. So manufacturing has actually become much more costly, even though they may have this extra benefit of protection. So Ford is a great example. They manufacture a lot of cars in the US, and so they're enjoying the protection of a 25% tariff on cars, but they also use imported auto parts and imported steel and imported aluminum as inputs to production. And so they're facing higher input costs because there's also a 25% tariff on auto parts and 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. And there are even reports of some companies that they were producing in the US and they're moving production outside of the US to other countries just to avoid paying these higher input costs. So the last thing I kind of want to mention is that in terms of kind of these potentially counterintuitive effects on employment and growth in the US, is that there are really always going to be trade-offs in terms of what can actually be produced in the US. The kind of backbone of international trade theory is the idea that countries can produce and consume more as a whole if they specialize and trade with each other than if they try to produce everything independently. And in the past, the U.S. has tended to specialize in producing certain things, high tech industries, services, and we sell these things and buy, things like clothes and toys and shoes in return. And so what this means is that we just don't currently have the infrastructure, the workers, the factories, the machines at the ready to kind of start producing immediately all of the imports that we're trying to block. And so, shifting production toward these things is going to require some kind of change in kind of, production capacity and require a lot of resources. It will also just mean that we can't produce as much of the stuff that, we've been producing up until now, the things that we tend to specialize. And so I think we don't really have a good picture of exactly what this transition will look like, because as I mentioned, we haven't seen tariffs at this level, for almost a century, when the economy was very different than it is today. So that's kind of a question of kind of how that transition is going to look, and what trade-offs we're going to have to make going forward. Last thing I just want to touch on briefly is, despite all of kind of these, potential warning signs in the data and the warnings from economists about the harm from tariffs to the economy, the stock market has been surprisingly kind of resilient over the past few months. And I don't really have too much to say about this, except for that, the market's immediate reaction to tariff news has been kind of consistent with what we'd expect. So when there are announcements of high tariffs, like there were, on Liberation Day, the market tends to fall. We saw this also last week before the August 1st deadline. And then when there are announcements of a tariff pause or lower than expected tariffs, the market tends to rise. So this is why we saw, an increase in stock prices when the U.S. announced that there would be 15% tariffs on Japan and the EU. I don't think the market was celebrating 15% tariffs, but they were celebrating the fact that those tariffs weren't even higher. And so this was considered good news. So that's all I have. I'll just kind of recap, but I think kind of mainly, at least my read of the data is that the effects of the tariffs are really just starting to set in. The brunt of the tariffs are just starting to kick in, and so we're going to probably see more and more of this going forward. My expectation is that consumers are going to continue to see higher prices for a lot of things that we purchase. Businesses are going to be facing these tighter margins. If the policy uncertainty continues, that's going to make it harder for them to kind of make decisions about investment and hiring, et cetera. And we didn't really talk about this, but there's a potential that other countries are going to retaliate, which will also make it harder for the U.S. To kind of do business on the global marketplace. And there's a lot of questions on exactly how things are exactly going to roll out going forward, but that's kind of what we know from now.
Lydia, Menzie, thank you. That is a great tour de force of things that are going on. And I'm just going to tell you, we got a lively chat thread tonight. People are animated about this topic. So I'm going to dig into a few things that have come up that are on my mind. Some of these overlap with the questions in the chat, which is definitely getting me excited. Menzie, why doesn't the BLS just use the ADP data? I mean, your chart seemed to show like the ADP data really tracked where the employment numbers actually kind of wound up, it seemed like. So do you think they think about that at all? And then I'm going to add one other thing. It's come up in the chat that before the election in 2024, employment was, the early estimates were vastly overstated relative to a major revision that happened later. And doesn't that make us worry a little bit that there could be some politics being played? And so I think you probably, and actually I do as well, have a little bit of insight into how do they actually produce this number and how many people are involved. And, my experience is there's a lot of people involved. And, for people that don't have faith in government to think the government could contain a conspiracy at that level seems kind of far-fetched to me. But in any case, let me just throw those things at you. Why don't they use the ADP data? And could they be fiddling with the numbers? And,
so those are excellent questions. And they're particularly germane at this time where it's, I think, increasingly hard to track the economy as it gets more complex and interrelated with the global economy. And in a time where the budgets of the statistical agencies have been cut in real terms over time and are slated to be cut further in the current budget proposal. Why don't they use the ADP numbers? I rescaled everything to start in, I think, October 2024, something like that. And so if you actually look at the numbers in the levels, you'll see that the BLS number is higher than ADP. Well, that's because BLS is trying to capture the whole universe of businesses, plus the government, which ADP doesn't cover. And so even in the measure that the BLS is covering for the private sector, it's trying to get a measure of the entire economy. ADP only has the number for the companies which it cuts the checks for. And so it's going to be excluding the biggest companies in the U.S. economy. Most of the employment in the U.S. economy is the smaller firms, right, that ADP might cover, but it's not the whole universe. And that's why, as people in these other who generate these alternative numbers will say, it's that the private sector it should not be taken as a substitute for the government numbers because they don't cover the same things, and so they're often a complement. That gets to this issue of could you have rigged the numbers for the BLS? It would be hard because in the case of prices, you've got lots of people going out to collect the prices, to get the numbers for the employment numbers. I mean, you've got a set of people who are calling companies, and you got a set of people who are calling households. There's lots of people there, and then there are lots of statisticians along the way, as you know, working on these things, and all this stuff is written down in what I perceive as mind-numbing detail about how to do it. And so as long as they're adhering to the manuals, there's a transparent, maybe not optimal, but transparent approach to putting these numbers together. And so, yes, you can make mistakes because, statistics is partly art, but even there, the manual tells you how to do the statistics. So it's what you're collecting. And, sometimes you just don't get all the data you need. And then, of course, is it the BLS commissioner who's going to alter it? Well, as she said on television the other day, by the time she's getting the final numbers, it's gone up and the memo is essentially written. And so there's no point she can't really change it. She might have authority, but essentially the number is given to him or her. And then memo gets written up. You know who gets it the night before? You and I know it's the president and the president's staff. So, I just don't see how you can rig the numbers. They're not perfect. I'll say that's why people who do big data analysis, that's the new frontier, using lots of data from commercial sources, they will say themselves, that they're complements, but they're not substitutes for what the government is going to collect, because the government has incentives to be transparent and unbiased.
Great. Thank you. Lydia, I want to characterize something I think you said that I believe is correct and important, and that is when there's a lot of uncertainty about what the tariffs are really going to be, it's less likely that producers would allow the tariffs to impact end prices because they don't want to provoke shopping behavior by consumers if the tariff is just going to go away in a month or two. It's sort of the same thing with exchange rates. If currency's move in a way that's going to make your product more expensive, you might squeeze your margins for a while to figure out if this currency movement is really going to last. And there's a fair bit of evidence that firms do that. But once a tariff feels permanent, I think you said it's very unlikely that in most industries, these producers have the kind of margins where they could eat 15 or 25% and still really make profitable sales into the market. So chances are they're going to try to pass it through, maybe not in entirety, but I'm guessing 75, 80% pass through for sure would be what I would think. Is that kind of a fair read of what you were suggesting about temporary versus permanent?
Yeah, exactly. Certainly, like if companies can if they think it's going to be short term and they can, maintain,
market
their
share,
customers and everything, there's some benefit, but I think it's, especially small businesses, especially companies that are both kind of getting hit from the higher input costs and kind of having these higher costs on final goods. It's hard to imagine that they're going to be able to kind of keep absorbing all of that forever. And then, the other piece of it that doesn't always get talked about as much is that the whole point of the tariffs is that it also allows U.S. companies who aren't really involved in imports to raise their prices as well, because now they have protection from, they're not kind of facing competition from these cheap imports to the same extent they were, so they can start kind of pushing their prices up as well. And so I expect we'll see some more of that.
I can tell we're both economists. That was my follow-up question for you, but you answered it without me even saying it. So to be concrete, all foreign wine is now going to be 20, 25% more expensive. what do you think is going to happen to my shipment from Sonoma or Napa going forward? It's going to go up. Of course it is. Not only because there's going to be a shift in demand toward domestics, in any case, that is, import competing goods are going to get more expensive as well, not just the imports. And, producers know how to make money for their owners. Of course they do. This is America, capitalism, mostly. Not so much anymore, but it was capitalism and people are used to that. Okay. Stock market, that's come up a few times. And it is one of these things that's a bit of a puzzler to some extent, because we're talking about things that maybe concern us a little bit about the economy, whether it's budget bill that looks fiscally kind of aggressive and could change people's long run perceptions. Not that, let's be clear, the Trump administration does not have a monopoly on deficit increasing budget bills. These have been going on under Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter, Congress, doesn't matter, the executive branch, it's a condition of politics. But there are things that are going on in the economy too, just in the private sector, like the advancement of artificial intelligence that is having a huge lift in the market. There's also, let's be fair, many people I talk to in private industry say regulation is less intensely enforced. They're more confident that there's not some kind of gotcha thing in their industry. More deals are likely to go through and not be, pushed back on, mergers and acquisitions maybe. The big beautiful bill does have some, aspects to it that will increase consumption spending. That's good for the market. The administration beating on the Fed could lead to looser monetary policy. Maybe that's good for the market, even if it's through an inflation channel. I mean, companies' valuations will go up with inflation and with demand. So to me, the behavior of the stock market isn't really a validation of any particular policy. That's an impact of many different things, a lot of which we're not talking about tonight. So just putting that out there. Steve Goldstein wondered the extent to which the tariff revenue will be a meaningful source of total revenue for the government and therefore contribute to reduction in the deficit potentially. So is there a good aspect to the tariffs along that dimension? And I don't know if that's a Menzie question or a Lydia question. It's kind of a macro question, but what do you think the administration thinks the new tariff regime is going to net them in annual revenue? Is it $400 billion or?
I can't remember the numbers offhand, but I do remember that it's, if you think about what personal income taxes bring in and what tariff revenue at max can bring in, I think it's about a fifth of what personal income taxes bring in. So there's no way to substitute one for the other. You cannot replace the personal income tax as currently established with just tariff revenue. Remember, because as Lydia will probably tell me what the elasticity is, if you increase tariffs, you're going to reduce imports. And so that's reducing the quantity which you can tax. Right?
It's a version of the Laffer curve.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, you put the tariffs high enough, there'll be zero revenue. The second thing I'll say is, even if you could replace part of the personal income tax revenue, it's an incredibly regressive way to collect revenue. I think it's probably hideously inefficient as well. I don't know the cost benefit, deadweight loss, but it's regressive at a minimum compared to personal income tax or other taxes. So on two counts, you would not want to rely heavily on tariffs. I think that's pretty clear, but I'll defer to Lydia on the specifics.
No, I mean that's pretty much what I was going to say, and I think the point about kind of if one of the goals is really to have the U.S. stop importing as much by raising the tariffs, you can't accomplish both things at the same time, right? You can't collect all this tariff revenue from imports, but also stop importing. And so that's where sort of the one of the biggest issues is.
Yeah, you can't have it both ways. If you stop imports and move the production back here, then you're not collecting as much revenue, if any. And if you don't stop imports, somebody's paying the tax, likely US consumers. And, there are a lot of economists who think we should maybe have higher consumption taxes because, one reason we have a trade deficit, right? It's not just, this is the tricky thing. I think everyone thinks we have a trade deficit because the trade policies are unfair. And people don't maybe think about, well, maybe we have a trade deficit because we consume more than we produce. And I don't know that the tariff adjustments we're looking at are going to change that basic fact. Certainly the big beautiful bill isn't going to change that because government is going to be spending more than it's taxing. There's the illusion of a free lunch there. And so I don't really see the policies in the aggregate getting the trade deficit down much. But it is true. The tariff is kind of a consumption tax and it would have income and substitution effects. And, it could reduce consumption to some extent, certainly in real terms. But, and I'm just not clear, is that going to hit poor people more than wealthy people, given what the pattern of imports is? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I guess Swiss watches are going to be more expensive, apparently, because they didn't get a very good deal.
I think offhand, we know that low-income households consume more goods relative to higher-income households right off the bat. Yep. And so you think about the things that are being imported from China previously. The lower-income households will disproportionately bear the burden of these tariffs. I think most studies, if they take a simple, not a general equilibrium model, but just tabulate who's importing, who's consuming what, by far the lower income deciles households will be suffering more. But just before I turn over, just to mention your point about will tariffs affect the trade deficit and the current account deficit, and I agree completely. To only, you think make imports more expensive, that'll do the trick. If you think that the reason why we are running the deficits, trade deficits, is because we consume more than we produce, it's only by tariffs or some other policies, like let's say shrinking the budget deficit, that you can really have a big impact. And I don't think there's empirical evidence that says the big effects on consumption in the aggregate you'll get from tariffs. I mean, so in theory, yes, you get these relative income and substitution effects, but I think the big action in reducing trade deficits and current account deficits is in budget deficit and possibly changing consumption activity. And I'm not sure tariffs are big enough to do that.
We have a question that came in from a viewer who goes by the Sports Bench. And it's a good data question. What department collects the tariffs? And does the department provide a public report on the amount? And if so, where can we find it? And how often is it reported? Thank you, Sports Bench. Lydia, do you know who's collecting the tariffs and where we can get the information on what's going on here?
Yeah, so U.S. Customs is the department that actually collects the tariffs. There may be more than one place to see the data, but I know that the U.S. Census Bureau, which is kind of the agency that publishes data on U.S. goods trade, they publish the amount of tariff revenue collected from each country and even on kind of specific products, and that gets published every month. So you can see actually in great detail kind of which products are revenue kind of being collected on, which countries, etc. That may not be the only source, but that's kind of the one that I'm the most familiar with.
We have a question from Nasos Lazaridis, if all these companies, well, if many companies brought production back to the US, how long is that going to take? And would we even have the workers to staff these new companies? And I'll just say, at current unemployment rates, probably not, unless we had a big increase in the labor force, or we had a lot of robots. But what are your thoughts on that question? Workers might have to come from other industries like the tech sector, which we built when we allowed manufacturing to shrink.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of toward the end of my slides. I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I think right now there's about almost 500,000 job openings in manufacturing that has kind of been there for a while. And these are kind of jobs that are there that companies are kind of having trouble filling those positions, which is just, probably another reason why, another source of uncertainty why businesses aren't necessarily rushing to kind of open up production here, because they don't know whether they can kind of staff all of that production, and you combine that with kind of the immigration policy and stuff that's going on. I think it's unclear, but certainly, we can't keep producing everything that we're producing right now and also produce everything else that we import, right? We don't have the space, we don't have the factories, we don't have the people to do all of it. So there has to be some kind of give and take when you try to bring some of that production back.
I think the way people say that now is, we don't have the cards. That's what we say. We don't have the cards, do we? We don't have the cards for that. Amy L., how do you think the Trump immigration policies will impact the economy? And in particular, the maybe going after farm workers and construction laborers. I don't know if we're going after them, but obviously there are a lot of workers in agriculture and construction that we think might lack appropriate documentation. Menzie or Lydia, is there anything that you see in the data or anything concerning about that? Or are we going to maybe look the other way in those sectors when ICE is out, trying to find undocumented people? I've gotten a whiff that maybe the farmers shouldn't be punished, but anything you have to say about that?
I mean, I'll just say for now, we don't have any statistical evidence upon the impact of those policies. We have simulations based upon, previous evidence about restrictive immigration policies, but, from a long time ago. So we have macro model simulations, which give you what you kind of expect qualitatively. You'll have decreased output and increased prices. And the question is how much? Well, it depends upon how restrictive we are in terms of both undocumented immigration, but also immigration overall. Because if you kick out somebody who's undocumented but their kids are documented, well, you're possibly taking out people who are also documented immigrants. Also mentioned, I was surprised to find that one of the sectors where you've got a lot of immigrant, not necessarily undocumented, but immigrant labor is manufacturing. So we have the stereotype that it's going to be construction and agriculture, yes, but overall immigrants are also represented heavily in certain sectors that you might not think. So the hits will probably be more broad, widespread than you'd think. As to the details, I don't know too much more. I don't have the information yet.
Do either of you have a sense that in some of these trade deals, we're getting great concessions from our trading partners? For example, with Japan, it was announced that they would be investing $500 billion in the U.S. economy. Over what horizon, I'm not sure. Reports were kind of vague about what that meant. And of course, I guess you all know that foreign countries have been investing a lot in the US economy. It's the mirror image of our trade deficit every year. It has to be that case. So what does it even mean that we're getting countries that say, oh yeah, we'll invest in the US when they already are? And how do you know that's incremental? I don't understand. Am I missing something about those types of deals?
Go ahead, Menzie, if you have.
Yeah, Lydia. Yeah, I mean, all I know is what I read, and I mean, literally, nothing's on paper. As you know, even the Japan deal, which you alluded to, it's not clear that the Japanese agree on either the number or the conditions, and the Trump administration has never enumerated them. So I really have no idea, except to extrapolate upon the promises received under the U.S.-China trade deal phase one. If you recall that from 2019, the Chinese made lots of promises, and Trump accepted them. If you look back to what the goalposts, the targets were achieved, I think you'll find the answer is none.
Be interesting to see how that unfolds. Susan Trapp wonders about the legality of the president having the power to set tariffs. And I've seen there's been some legal challenges to that. And I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on where those cases are going to land? And I don't know which of the two of you is better positioned to take that one.
I mean, so I think, most basically, like, historically, Congress is the body that has the power to set tariffs. And over time, there have been some kind of exceptions that have been made to give the president more power to set tariffs, but they're typically under very specific conditions. So some of the tariffs that have been imposed are under this thing called Section 232. That's a case where there's some threat to national security. There's a couple of other cases that are similar where the president is allowed to impose tariffs. In those cases, there's usually a formal investigation that's done by the International Trade Commission, and there's a process that has to be gone through. The tariffs are usually temporary, and there's some kind of bounds on how they're put in place. And so, at least my understanding of trade law is that these are not legal, and I can't predict it. It's sort of my guess that at least in some of the lower courts, they will be ruled as illegal, and then it's hard to say what will happen if the case goes up to the Supreme Court. But I think international courts and kind of the lower courts have sort of agreed that they're not legal.
Lydia, I'm going to ask you another question about trade and tariffs. I think, many people feel like the U.S. was subjected to much higher tariffs than we were imposing on others. And so why wouldn't it be better for us to set our tariffs at the level of the tariffs we're facing? And of course, that's one of those things economists, I think we've, believed for a long time, that doesn't really matter what the other country's doing. Even if they're subsidizing their industries, like, well, we'll just take the free stuff and we'll produce what makes sense for us. And as it's turned out in the US, that is really being very heavy, overweight technology, obviously, and services. But, maybe we've missed some things in manufacturing. But do you feel like it doesn't really matter what the other country's tariffs are? It's still probably better for us to just let the goods in at whatever price we can get them. How do you feel as an economist about that issue?
I think that the tariffs that are in place are tariffs that the U.S. and, the whole world actually sat down and kind of negotiated over, many, many years of, countries kind of coming to the table and saying, here's what we think is important. Here are the products that we want low tariffs on. Here's what we're willing to give you low tariffs on. And so, at different kind of points in history, the U.S. was able to sort of decide what they wanted to protect more heavily and not. And so it's not it's something that was sort of agreed upon by countries in terms of kind of what the set of rates that are in place, at least until now. So I think it's not the right thing to say, well, we have, low tariffs on shoes and other countries have high tariffs on shoes, because shoes weren't like the important thing for the U.S. to protect. And so you have to really think about kind of which industries are, it's not quite that simple.
Yeah, it's not like everybody just crammed this down on us.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I always, it's so interesting. I always go back to, when I started to study economics in earnest, everyone thought Germany and Japan were about to eclipse the United States because they started taking market share in steel and autos, and, we couldn't compete. Appliances, electronics, it was getting tougher. They seemed more efficient. But of course, what was really going on is the best talent in this country was flowing into computing and telecommunications and other industries. And of course, what's happened over this 40 years, it's not that Germany and Japan eclipsed us. They have become maybe bigger in manufacturing, and we've become enormous in the highest margin industry in history. And that's what's kind of powered the US economy and allowed a lot of this consumption, even beyond what we produce, because we're the wealthiest country. Of course, we're going to consume off of some of that wealth, not just out of our current production. So I think, we're at the top of the hour, actually a little bit past. We'll have to shut it down for now, but I really want to thank you both for being here and really shedding a lot of critical light on some of the big issues facing the economy. And it's obviously middle innings, and maybe Trumponomics will turn out to be fantastic. We'll see. There's a lot more of the story to be written, but it's certainly an interesting time, and a big experiment in the data is unfolding as we speak. So we will be talking about it again. And I really appreciate you taking time out of Tuesday night to be with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
So, and thank you to our audience. Very lively chat tonight. Just a lot of great questions. Can't really thank you enough for everything that you've all contributed to the show. That's what makes it fun. And we will be back in September, and things are changing so rapidly. We don't yet know which topic we're going to tackle in September, but it'll be interesting, I promise you. All right. Thanks for joining us tonight, and on Wisconsin.